The dust clouds kicked up by the afternoon wind swirled around the wooden sidewalks of Cedar Ridge, a small frontier town nestled in the heart of Texas cattle country. The year was 1876, and life moved at the pace of horse hooves and cattle drives. Main Street bustled with the usual activity of a Saturday afternoon, as families gathered at the general store and saloon after a long week of ranch work and farming. Margaret O'Sullivan stepped carefully down from her father's weathered buckboard wagon, her worn leather shoes making soft contact with the dusty ground. The shoes, once a rich brown but now faded to a pale tan from countless repairs and frontier hardships, had been her only pair for nearly 3 years. Her father, Patrick, worked as the town's blacksmith and farrier, but the scattered ranches and homesteads barely provided enough work to keep beans on their table, let alone money for store-bought luxuries. At 18, Margaret possessed a natural beauty that seemed to shine despite the harsh realities of frontier life. Her copper-red hair caught the Texas sunlight as it fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, braided simply to keep it from her face during long days helping at the smithy. Her emerald green eyes held a warmth and determination that spoke of Irish heritage and frontier resilience. She wore a simple calico dress in faded blue, carefully patched and mended, that her late mother had sewn from fabric traded for horseshoes 3 seasons past. The dress was clean and pressed, showing the care she took despite their circumstances, but it could not hide the reality of their modest means in a town where appearances often determined social standing. The church social was being held in the town square, organized to celebrate the arrival of the new preacher and raise funds for a proper schoolhouse. Families from homesteads and ranches for 20 miles around had gathered, making it the largest social event Cedar Ridge had seen all year. Margaret had been looking forward to this rare opportunity to see friends scattered across the vast territory. However, her anticipation quickly soured as she approached the refreshment table set up beneath the large oak tree. Victoria Ashworth, daughter of the town's wealthiest cattle baron, stood surrounded by several other young women from the established ranching families. Victoria wore an elaborate dress of emerald silk that had clearly been ordered from back east, and her feet were adorned with polished leather boots that had never known honest work or long walks across prairie grass. "Well, I declare," Victoria announced loudly enough for half the gathering to hear, her affected southern drawl carrying across the square. "Margaret O'Sullivan, are those the very same shoes you wore to the barn raising last spring, and the harvest celebration before that?" The other young women tittered behind their fans, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced down at her shoes, suddenly conscious of every crack in the leather and every careful stitch her father had used to extend their life. The boots had been oiled and cleaned that morning, but they could not disguise years of faithful service. "Some folks simply do not understand the importance of proper presentation," added Constance Hammond, whose father owned the largest spread in 3 counties. She lifted her riding skirt just enough to display her own new boots, the leather still supple and unmarked by honest labour. "My dear mother always said that a lady's character shows first in how she adorns her feet." Margaret stood motionless, feeling the weight of curious stares from other townspeople who had begun to take notice of the commotion. In frontier society, where resources were scarce and everyone understood hardship, there was still an unspoken hierarchy based on land ownership and cattle wealth. Being seen as unable to maintain proper appearances could affect not just personal reputation, but her father's business prospects as well. "Perhaps some people should consider whether they truly belong at such refined gatherings," Victoria continued, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never known want. "After all, this is meant to be a respectable social occasion, and we must maintain certain standards if Cedar Ridge is to attract quality settlers and businesses." The words cut deeply because Margaret understood their implication. In a growing frontier town, social standing often determined economic opportunities. Her father's smithy business depended on the goodwill of the ranchers and townspeople, and being seen as socially inferior could mean fewer customers and harder times ahead. Just as Margaret was gathering her courage to respond with dignity and tact, the sound of spurs jingling on wooden planks caught everyone's attention. The group of young women turned to see a tall figure approaching, his worn but well-maintained boots making a steady rhythm on the makeshift dance floor. James Jake Carson had ridden into Cedar Ridge territory 6 months earlier, driving a small herd of longhorns and carrying little more than his horse, his rope, and a reputation for straight dealing that had preceded him from Colorado. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and lean build of a man born to the saddle, and his sun-weathered hands told the story of someone who understood that honest work was the foundation of character. Jake wore clean denim pants, a pressed white shirt, and a leather vest that showed quality craftsmanship despite obvious age. His dark hair was neatly trimmed beneath his well-shaped hat, and his steel-grey eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down everything from stampeding cattle to claim jumpers and emerged with his principles intact. "Ladies," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat with genuine respect. His voice carried the easy authority of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to raise his tone. "I hope this fine afternoon finds you all well and enjoying our community's hospitality." The young women who had been so bold in their criticism suddenly found themselves uncertain, their confidence wavering under the steady gaze of a man whose reputation commanded respect throughout the territory. Victoria managed a nervous smile while smoothing her expensive skirts, and Constance fidgeted with her fan. Jake's attention moved deliberately across the group before settling on Margaret with unmistakable warmth and genuine admiration. "Miss O'Sullivan, I was wondering if you might honour me with your company for the next dance. I understand you know all the finest steps, and I could surely use some guidance from someone with your grace." The invitation hung in the warm Texas air like a challenge that everyone present understood. Margaret felt her heart skip as she looked up into Jake's sincere grey eyes, while Victoria and her circle of friends exchanged glances of surprise and barely concealed irritation. In the social hierarchy of Cedar Ridge, Jake Carson had quickly earned respect as an honest cattleman with prospects, making his attention valuable currency in the marriage-minded calculations of frontier society. "I would be honoured, Mr. Carson," Margaret replied softly, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. She had noticed Jake at previous gatherings, admiring from afar his quiet confidence and the respectful way he treated everyone regardless of their station. She had never imagined he might notice her, especially given the circumstances of her family's modest means. Jake extended his arm with the practiced courtesy of a man raised with proper manners, and Margaret placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. As they walked toward the area where other couples were gathering for the next dance, she became acutely aware that many eyes followed their movement across the square. The fiddle player was tuning his instrument while the caller prepared to announce the next set. "Miss O'Sullivan," Jake said quietly as they took their place among the other dancers, "I hope you will not think me too forward, but I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you for some time. Your father has done excellent work on my horses, and I have heard nothing but praise for your character from everyone who knows you well." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You are very kind, Mr. Carson. Father speaks highly of your horsemanship and says you treat your animals with more care than some men show their families." The fiddle began to play a lively reel, and the caller's voice rang out over the gathering crowd. "Form your squares, ladies and gentlemen. We will start with Cotton-Eyed Joe and see if we can work up a proper celebration." As the dance began, Margaret found herself swept up in the familiar patterns and steps she had learned at barn raisings and harvest celebrations. Jake proved to be an excellent partner, leading her through the figures with gentle confidence and obvious skill. His hands were calloused from rope and rein, but his touch was careful and respectful as they moved through the promenade and dosido. During a brief pause between figures, Victoria Ashworth appeared at Jake's elbow with her most charming smile. "Mr. Carson, surely you would not deny the rest of us ladies the pleasure of your company. I do believe the next dance is a waltz, and I have been practicing the steps I learned in San Antonio." Jake's response was polite but firm. "Miss Ashworth, I appreciate the invitation, but I have already promised the remainder of this set to Miss O'Sullivan. Perhaps another time when she is otherwise engaged." The dismissal, delivered with perfect courtesy, nonetheless carried unmistakable finality. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, and Margaret noticed Constance Hammond whispering behind her fan to the other young women clustered nearby. The social dynamics of the situation were clear to everyone present, and Margaret realized that Jake's public preference had shifted the balance of the afternoon's events. As the waltz began, Jake placed one hand respectfully at Margaret's waist while taking her other hand in his own. The intimate nature of the dance, considered quite modern and slightly scandalous by some of the older residents, required them to move closer together than the previous country dances had allowed. I hope you will forgive my boldness, Jake said quietly as they began to move to the gentle rhythm. But I could not stand by and watch those young ladies treat you with such discourtesy. In my experience, true quality shows itself through kindness and character, not through expensive clothing or family connections. Margaret looked up at him with surprise and growing admiration. You risk your standing in the community by defending someone like me, Mr. Carson. The Ashworths and Hammonds carry considerable influence in this territory. Jake's expression grew serious as he guided her through a gentle turn. Miss O'Sullivan, I have spent enough years on the frontier to learn that a man's reputation is built on his actions, not on his willingness to court favor with those who mistake wealth for worth. Your father is one of the most honest men I have encountered, and you have shown more grace in 10 minutes than some folks manage in a lifetime. The music swirled around them as they moved across the makeshift dance floor, and Margaret found herself forgetting about the curious stares and whispered comments from the crowd. For these few precious minutes, she felt like the belle of the ball, protected and valued by a man whose respect was worth more than all the expensive boots in Texas. You speak of grace, Mr. Carson, but I fear my shoes tell a different story about my circumstances, Margaret said with a rueful smile, glancing down at her worn footwear. Jake followed her gaze and then looked back up at her with an expression of gentle intensity. Miss O'Sullivan, I have known ladies in Denver and Cheyenne who wore boots that cost more than most folks see in a year, but who could not spare a kind word for a child or a helping hand for a neighbor. Grace is not something that can be bought in any store, and it shines brightest in those who have learned to value substance over appearance. As the waltz drew to a close, Jake led Margaret to the edge of the dance area where several families were enjoying refreshments and conversation. Margaret's father, Patrick O'Sullivan, approached them with a smile that showed both pride and slight concern. The blacksmith was a stocky man with greying hair and hands marked by years at the forge, but his eyes held the same warmth and intelligence that characterized his daughter. Mr. Carson, I see you have discovered that my Margaret is light on her feet, Patrick said with the easy familiarity of a man comfortable in any company. I hope she has not talked your ear off about books and learning. She has been after me to send away for more reading material. Jake smiled warmly at the older man. On the contrary, Mr. O'Sullivan, I find your daughter's conversation most enlightening. It is refreshing to meet someone who values education and improvement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square as the social gathering continued around them. Margaret felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced in months, standing between her father and Jake Carson, while other families enjoyed the festivities. The music had shifted to a slower tempo, and couples strolled arm in arm, while children played games between the wagons and horses tied along Main Street. Mr. Carson, Patrick O'Sullivan continued, his weathered hands gesturing toward the new church construction visible beyond the square. Margaret has been helping me keep the books for the smithy, and she has a head for numbers that puts most grown men to shame. She figured out how to track which ranchers pay on time and which ones need gentle reminding. Margaret felt her cheeks warm at her father's praise, but Jake's expression showed genuine interest rather than the polite tolerance she had come to expect from most men when the conversation turned to women's capabilities beyond household duties. That is a valuable skill in any business, Jake replied thoughtfully. I have been struggling to keep proper records of my cattle sales and expenses. Perhaps you might offer some guidance, Miss O'Sullivan, if your father could spare you for an afternoon sometime. The suggestion was both practical and socially significant. In frontier communities, a young unmarried woman spending time at a bachelor's ranch, even for business purposes, would be noticed and discussed by everyone in the territory. Margaret understood the implications, as did her father, whose expression grew more serious. Before anyone could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the approach of Reverend Samuel Hayes, the new preacher whose arrival had prompted the day's celebration. The Reverend was a tall, thin man in his 40s, with silver-streaked hair and the earnest demeanor of someone committed to bringing civilization and moral order to the frontier. Mr. O'Sullivan, Mr. Carson, the Reverend said with a warm smile, I wanted to thank you both for your contributions to our church building fund. Your generosity will help ensure that Cedar Ridge has a proper place of worship for generations to come. Margaret looked at Jake with surprise, unaware that he had made such a contribution. New arrivals to the territory typically focus their resources on establishing their own homesteads and businesses before contributing to community projects. His donation suggested both financial stability and genuine commitment to the town's future. "It is an investment in the community, Reverend Hayes," Jake replied modestly. "A town needs strong institutions to attract good families and honest businesses." The Reverend turned his attention to Margaret with paternal kindness. "Miss O'Sullivan, I understand you have been teaching reading to some of the younger children in the area. That is Christian service of the highest order, and I hope you will consider helping with our Sunday school once the church is completed." "I would be honored, Reverend," Margaret answered, feeling pride at the recognition of her efforts. She had been working with 3 ranch families to help their children learn basic reading and arithmetic, traveling to their homesteads when weather and chores permitted. "Education is the foundation of progress," Jake added, his voice carrying conviction. "I have seen too many good people taken advantage of because they could not read contracts or keep proper accounts. Miss O'Sullivan's work is building a stronger future for this entire territory." As they spoke, Margaret noticed Victoria Ashworth and her friends had positioned themselves within earshot, clearly listening to every word. Victoria's expression had grown increasingly sour as the afternoon progressed, and Jake's attention remained focused on Margaret rather than on the young women from more prominent families. How noble of some people to make such grand statements about education and character, Victoria said loudly enough to interrupt their conversation. "Of course, it is easy to speak of inner worth when one has so little outer refinement to recommend them." The comment was clearly directed at Margaret, and the cruel intent was unmistakable. Several nearby families turned to observe what was obviously becoming a more serious social confrontation. Patrick O'Sullivan's jaw tightened, and Margaret felt her stomach clench with embarrassment and growing anger. Jake's expression hardened as he turned to face Victoria directly. "Miss Ashworth, I believe there may be some confusion about what constitutes refinement in civilized society. Where I come from, true ladies do not use public gatherings to belittle others less fortunate than themselves." "Less fortunate?" Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Mr. Carson, surely you can see the difference between those of us raised with proper advantages and those who—" She paused, looking pointedly at Margaret's worn shoes, "those who clearly belong in a different social sphere altogether." The tension in the gathering crowd was palpable. Reverend Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his desire to maintain peace and his obligation to address unchristian behavior. Other families had stopped their conversations to watch the confrontation, and Margaret realized that whatever happened next would be discussed throughout the territory for months to come. Margaret felt tears threatening, but refused to give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She had endured months of subtle slights and social exclusion, but this public humiliation felt like more than she could bear with dignity intact. Jake stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Margaret and Victoria. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to facing down dangerous situations with calm determination. "Miss Ashworth, I have had the privilege of knowing ladies from Denver to New Orleans, from ranch houses to governor's mansions. I have learned that true refinement cannot be purchased with cattle money or family connections. It grows from kindness, courage, and the strength to treat others with respect, regardless of their circumstances." He paused, his steel-grey eyes meeting Victoria's with unwavering directness. "Miss O'Sullivan has shown more genuine grace in one afternoon than I have witnessed from some folks who consider themselves the height of frontier society. Any man with sense would count himself fortunate to know someone of her character." The words rang across the square like a challenge, and everyone present understood that Jake Carson had just declared his intentions as publicly as frontier courtesy allowed. Victoria's face flushed red with anger and humiliation, while Margaret felt her heart race with a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming emotion. Patrick O'Sullivan placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder, his expression showing both pride in Jake's defense and concern for the social consequences that might follow such a dramatic public statement. The silence that followed Jake's declaration stretched across the town square like the calm before a thunderstorm. Victoria Ashworth stood frozen, her carefully composed social mask cracking under the weight of public rejection by one of the territory's most eligible bachelors. The gathered families watched, with the fascination that frontier communities reserved for dramatic confrontations that would be retold around dinner tables for years to come. Constance Hammond was the first to break the tension, stepping forward to link arms with Victoria in a show of solidarity. "Well, I never," she declared with affected outrage. Mr. Carson, your time on the trail has clearly affected your judgment regarding proper society. Perhaps when you have established yourself more permanently in our community, you will better understand the natural order of things. Jake's expression remained calm, but Margaret could see the steel in his grey eyes as he regarded the two young women. Miss Hammond, I appreciate your concern for my understanding of society. However, I have found that the natural order tends to reveal itself quite clearly to those willing to observe with honest eyes. Reverend Hayes, sensing an opportunity to restore peace, stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture of reconciliation. Friends, surely we can find common ground in Christian charity and community spirit. This is a day of celebration after all, and we are all neighbours in this vast territory. Indeed, Reverend, said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Charles Ashworth, Victoria's father and owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, had arrived with several other prominent ranchers. His presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the confrontation, as his economic influence touched nearly every family in the area. Charles Ashworth was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his opinions carry weight. He had built his ranch from nothing after the war, and his success had made him a powerful voice in territorial politics and business matters. Mr. Carson, Ashworth said with carefully controlled courtesy, I believe you may not fully understand the delicate social balance that keeps a frontier community functioning smoothly. My daughter and her friends represent the families that provide stability and growth for this territory. Jake met the older man's gaze without flinching. Mr. Ashworth, I have great respect for what you have built here, and I understand the importance of community leadership. However, I have also learned that true stability comes from treating all community members with fairness and respect, not from maintaining artificial divisions based on wealth or family connections. Margaret watched this exchange with growing anxiety, realizing that Jake was risking his future prospects in the territory by defending her so publicly. The Ashworth influence extended to banking, land deals, and cattle contracts that could make or break a new rancher's success. Her father's blacksmith business also depended on goodwill from the major ranchers. Perhaps, Margaret said quietly, finding her voice despite the tremor of nervousness, we should not let social concerns overshadow the real purpose of today's gathering. We are here to celebrate our community's growth and to welcome Reverend Hayes to Cedar Ridge. Her attempt at peacekeeping was gentle but clear, and several of the older women in the crowd nodded approvingly at her maturity and grace under pressure. Patrick O'Sullivan squeezed her shoulder with pride, while Jake's expression softened with admiration for her diplomatic courage. Victoria, however, was not ready to let the matter rest. How convenient that some people can speak of community spirit while obviously reaching above their proper station, she said with venomous sweetness. I suppose when one has nothing to lose, it becomes easy to ignore social proprieties. The cruelty of the comment hung in the air, and Margaret felt something inside her finally break free from months of patient endurance. She stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with quiet fire, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had found her limit. Miss Ashworth, you speak of proper stations and social proprieties, but I wonder if you understand what those words truly mean. My father has shod your horses and repaired your wagon wheels with honest skill and fair prices. I have helped teach children to read and write so they might build better lives for themselves. We have contributed to this community through work and service, not through inherited wealth or social position. The crowd stirred with surprise at Margaret's composed but firm response. Women in frontier society were expected to avoid direct confrontation, especially with their social superiors, but Margaret's dignity and quiet strength commanded attention. True social propriety, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, means treating others with kindness and respect regardless of their circumstances. It means judging people by their character and actions rather than by their clothing or family connections. If that understanding places me outside your definition of proper society, then I am content to remain where I am. Jake's face lit up with unmistakable pride and admiration as he watched Margaret stand her ground with such grace and conviction. Patrick O'Sullivan nodded approvingly, while Reverend Hayes smiled with the satisfaction of seeing Christian principles defended with both courage and humility. Charles Ashworth studied Margaret with new interest, his expression suggesting that her response had surprised him and perhaps earned a measure of his respect. Miss O'Sullivan, he said finally, You speak with considerable eloquence for someone so young. Perhaps there is more substance to this discussion than I initially understood. The admission was slight but significant, representing a crack in the social wall that Victoria had tried to build around Margaret. Other community members began to murmur among themselves, and Margaret could sense that the tide of public opinion was shifting in ways that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Jake stepped closer to Margaret, his presence offering support while allowing her to maintain her independence in the confrontation. Mr. Ashworth, your daughter and her friends have raised important questions about community standards and social expectations. I believe Miss O'Sullivan has provided answers that reflect the best values of frontier society. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the town square as the confrontation reached its pivotal moment. Margaret stood with quiet dignity between her father and Jake, while the entire community seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see how the social drama would resolve itself. Charles Ashworth remained silent for several long moments, his experienced eyes moving from Margaret to Jake to his own daughter, who stood rigidly beside Constance Hammond with barely controlled fury. The cattle baron had not built his empire by making hasty decisions, and Margaret could see him calculating the various implications of what had transpired. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I believe it is time for us to return home. Your mother will be expecting us for dinner, and we have an early morning ahead of us tomorrow." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable, and Victoria's face flushed with humiliation at being called to heel in such a public manner. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but something in her father's expression made her reconsider. With as much dignity as she could muster, she gathered her skirts and moved toward the family wagon without another word. "Mr. Carson," Ashworth continued, turning his attention to Jake with a measuring look, "I would be interested in discussing your cattle operations sometime soon. I understand you have been developing some innovative approaches to range management that might benefit the entire territory." The olive branch was subtle but significant. By acknowledging Jake's business acumen and suggesting future cooperation, Ashworth was signaling to the entire community that the young rancher remained in good standing despite the afternoon's confrontation. It was a political move that preserved everyone's dignity while establishing new social boundaries. Jake nodded respectfully. "I would welcome that conversation, Mr. Ashworth. I believe there are opportunities for cooperation that could benefit all the ranchers in this area." As the Ashworth party departed, the tension in the square began to dissipate like morning mist before the sun. Other families resumed their conversations and activities, though Margaret noticed many curious glances in her direction. The afternoon's events had shifted social dynamics in ways that would take time to fully understand. Reverend Hayes approached the small group with a warm smile. "Miss O'Sullivan, I must say that your conduct this afternoon has been exemplary. You have shown that true Christian grace lies not in avoiding conflict, but in facing it with honesty, courage, and forgiveness." "Thank you, Reverend," Margaret replied, feeling emotionally drained but strangely liberated. "I hope that some good might come from such an uncomfortable situation." "I believe it already has," Jake said quietly, his grey eyes meeting hers with unmistakable warmth. "You have shown everyone here, including myself, what genuine strength and character look like. That is a gift to this entire community." Patrick O'Sullivan had been observing the exchanges with the careful attention of a man whose daughter's future might depend on the day's outcomes. Now he stepped forward and extended his hand to Jake with obvious approval. "Mr. Carson, I want to thank you for standing up for Margaret today. It took considerable courage to risk your position in the community for the sake of what was right." Jake shook the blacksmith's hand firmly. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I hope you will not think me too forward, but I would very much like to call on Margaret properly, with your permission. Today's events have only confirmed what I had already begun to understand about her character." The formal request, made publicly in accordance with frontier courtship customs, represented a significant commitment. Margaret felt her heart race as she looked at her father, hoping desperately that he would give his consent to what she realized she wanted more than anything. Patrick smiled broadly, his weathered face showing both relief and pride. "Mr. Carson, you have my permission and my blessing. Any man who would defend my daughter's honor so publicly is welcome at our table any time." Margaret felt tears of joy threatening to spill over as she looked at Jake with wonder and growing hope. "Mr. Carson, I would be honored to receive your calls." The simple exchange of promises, witnessed by the gathered community, carried the weight of an engagement announcement in frontier society. Several nearby families approached to offer congratulations and good wishes, their acceptance serving to cement Margaret's new social position. As the social gathering began to wind down with the approaching evening, Jake walked Margaret and her father to their wagon. The worn vehicle suddenly seemed less humble and more simply practical, while Margaret's carefully mended dress appeared elegant rather than shabby. "Miss O'Sullivan," Jake said as he helped her into the wagon seat, "I hope you will not think less of me for causing such a commotion today. I simply could not stand by and watch you be treated with such discourtesy." Margaret looked down at him with shining eyes. "Mr. Carson, you have given me something I never thought I would have. The knowledge that someone sees worth in me beyond my circumstances. That is a gift more precious than any store-bought boots could ever be." Jake smiled up at her, his weathered hand resting briefly on hers. "Margaret, if I may be so bold, I believe you have always possessed that worth. Today simply gave the rest of us the opportunity to recognize what was already there." As Patrick clicked to the horses and the wagon began to roll down Main Street toward home, Margaret turned to wave goodbye to Jake, who stood watching them depart with his hat in his hands. The afternoon sun caught the copper highlights in her hair, and for the first time in months, she felt beautiful not because of her clothing or possessions, but because someone had seen the grace that lived within her heart. The worn shoes on her feet no longer seemed like symbols of poverty and social exclusion. Instead, they had become reminders that true worth could not be purchased, that genuine grace grew from character rather than circumstances, and that love, when it finally arrived, cared nothing for the superficial markers of social standing. 3 months had passed since the church social that changed everything in Cedar Ridge, and the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter across the Texas prairie. The new church building stood completed at last, its white-painted walls and simple bell tower representing the community's commitment to civilization and moral progress on the frontier. Margaret stood before the mirror in her modest bedroom, adjusting the ivory silk dress that had belonged to her mother. Patrick had carefully preserved the gown through years of hardship, knowing that someday his daughter would need it for the most important day of her life. The dress had been altered to fit Margaret's slender frame, and the result was simple elegance that needed no elaborate decoration to enhance her natural beauty. On her feet, Margaret wore new boots of fine brown leather, a wedding gift from Jake that had arrived 2 weeks earlier, along with a note explaining that while her old shoes had taught him the true meaning of grace, he wanted their new life together to begin with every comfort he could provide. The boots fit perfectly, crafted by a skilled cobbler in San Antonio, according to measurements Jake had somehow obtained without her knowledge. "You look beautiful." "Daughter," Patrick said from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. The blacksmith wore his best suit, carefully pressed and brushed for the occasion, and his weathered hands held a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from the prairie that morning. Margaret turned to embrace her father, feeling overwhelming gratitude for the man who had raised her with such patient love, despite their difficult circumstances. "Father, I hope I can be as good a wife to Jake as you have been a parent to me." "Margaret, you have already shown him the woman you are, and he has chosen you, knowing full well what a treasure he is receiving. Now come, we must not keep your groom waiting." The short walk to the church took them past the businesses and homes of Cedar Ridge, where neighbors had gathered along Main Street to offer congratulations and good wishes. Margaret waved to familiar faces, including several ranch families whose children she had taught to read during the long summer months. At the church steps, Reverend Hayes waited with Jake, who looked handsome and confident in a new black suit that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders. His steel-grey eyes lit up with unmistakable joy as he saw Margaret approaching on her father's arm, and she felt her heart skip with the same overwhelming emotion she had experienced that first afternoon when he had asked her to dance. The simple church was filled to capacity with members of the community who had come to witness the union of two people whose courtship had become something of a local legend. Charles Ashworth sat in the third row with his family, his presence serving as tacit approval of the match. Victoria had returned from an extended visit to relatives in Dallas the previous week, apparently reconciled to the new social realities in Cedar Ridge. As Patrick placed Margaret's hand in Jake's and stepped back to his seat, she looked up into the face of the man who had seen past her worn shoes to recognize the woman she truly was. The ceremony that followed was traditional and heartfelt, with Reverend Hayes speaking eloquently about love, commitment, and the importance of building strong families on the frontier. "Jake Carson," the Reverend said, "do you take Margaret to be your lawful wedded wife? To love and protect her through prosperity and hardship, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake replied firmly, his voice carrying across the church with absolute certainty. "Margaret O'Sullivan, do you take Jake to be your lawful wedded husband, to love and support him through prosperity and hardship, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Margaret felt tears of joy threatening as she looked into Jake's eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. "I do," she answered, her voice clear and strong. As Jake slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The social humiliation that had seemed so devastating 3 months earlier had become the catalyst for finding true love and acceptance. The worn shoes that had marked her as socially inferior had ultimately led her to a man who understood that grace could not be purchased at any price. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and reverent, witnessed by a community that had learned important lessons about character, worth, and the difference between superficial appearances and genuine value. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and celebration. The reception that followed was held in the town square, with tables of food contributed by families from throughout the territory. Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers, including several young women who had previously excluded her from their social circle but now sought her friendship with the understanding that she had married one of the most eligible and respected men in the area. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Jake and Margaret stood together, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow they would begin their life together at Jake's expanding ranch, where Margaret would help build not just a home, but a legacy that would contribute to the growth and prosperity of Cedar Ridge for generations to come. "Mrs. Carson," Jake said softly, using her new name for the first time, "do you have any regrets about the path that brought us together?" Margaret smiled up at her husband, thinking of all the painful moments and social slights that had seemed so important just months before. "Jake, I have learned that sometimes what appears to be our greatest disadvantage becomes our greatest blessing. Those old shoes taught me that real worth comes from within, and they led me to a man who understood that truth." Jake pulled her close as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Margaret, you taught me that grace is not something that can be bought with money or inherited through family connections. It grows in the heart and shows itself through kindness, courage, and strength of character. You had all of those qualities long before I met you." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the community that had witnessed their journey from social outcasts to respected couple, Margaret realized that her story had become something larger than personal triumph. It had become a testament to the frontier values of hard work, genuine worth, and the possibility of finding love and acceptance regardless of social circumstances. The worn shoes that had once marked her shame were now stored carefully in her hope chest, not as reminders of poverty, but as symbols of the journey that had led her to understand that true grace, like true love, could never be bought. It could only be earned, recognized, and cherished by those wise enough to see beyond surface appearances to the treasure that lay beneath. In the years that followed, Margaret and Jake Carson would become pillars of the Cedar Ridge community, their ranch prospering and their family growing. But they would never forget the afternoon when a cowboy's simple declaration that grace isn't bought had changed not just their own lives, but the understanding of an entire frontier town about what truly mattered in measuring human worth. The end.